Okay, so we're in the verses here. We're up to
Page 18, right?
Page
Page 18.
I think, well, if you have the same as mine before that, it's page 16. Vayitnu aleinu avodah kasha. They put on us hard work. And the Hagaddah brings the pasuk from Shmos, Vayavidu Mitzrayim es bnei Yisrael beforech. The Egyptians made the Jews work with forech. Forech is somehow a description of very hard work. Now, I'm going to tell you a vort on the word forech. I want you to tell me, where in Jewish literature does this vort come from? What kind of author would give us an idea like this? Pei Reish Chaf is a code. And in order to decode it, you need to take the two steps. First of all, use atbash. Atbash means that you associate aleph with taf, beis with shin, gimel with resh, going in from the outside, and exchange the letters. So vayitnu aleinu avodah kasha. So you have here a pei, resh, and a chaf. A pei is 6 letters from the end, so it gets exchanged for a vav. A resh is 3 letters from the end, so it gets exchanged for a gimel. And the chaf is 13 letters from the end, so it gets exchanged for the letter which is 13 letters from the beginning, which is a lamed. So now you have vav gimel lamed. That's step 1. Step 2 is take the gematria. The vav is 6, the gimel is 3 is 9, and lamed is 30 is 39. Elu halamed tes malachos that are usher to do on Shabbos, and that characterize the work of the Mishkan, and that's what the Mitzrayim made us to do in Egypt. They made us to do all 39 of those malachos. Who says azah vort? Atbash and gematria together to get from Farach to 39 malachos. Yeah.
I was going to ask Rabbi, I would think Lamed Vav Gimel, right? As letters. So I was reading, we're doing the Psachim right now. So it says that you have to drink a log of wine.
A
log?
It's a volume measure.
Oh, a lug.
And the Farshim drink. I was wondering maybe that has to do with somehow could be.
It's an interesting point. I didn't see them mention that. The ones who made this vort did not mention that. But where does this come from in Jewish literature? So those who are looking at the recording, think to yourself, oh, I know, it must be a Sephardi Makubal. Or it might be a Hasidic Sefer. Okay, we'll take that as a compliment. That's probably where it's coming from. Well, it's Tosfos, thank you. Tosfos and Arvi Psachim. So I say, yes, Tosfos was a Sephardi Makubal. Yes, Tosfos was a Chassid. Don't put these people on the side. They are as mainstream as Tosfos. Unbelievable thing, huh? Okay. But this now gives you a connection. The malachos that are us on Shabbos are taken from the Mishkan. The dramatic thing the Torah says in several places is you don't build the Mishkan on Shabbos. And the reason for that is not obvious. Because the avoda that you're going to do in the Mishkan is Docha Shabbos. You do many malachos when you do the avoda. Why shouldn't building the place in which you do that avoda be Docha Shabbos? That's not obvious at all. The Torah tells it to us in several psukim. That means the Torah is telling us something which without the Torah telling us would not be obvious. We would not jump to that conclusion. And so, these are the things which Shabbos replaces. You don't do them on Shabbos. They are the activities which are used to create the place in which HaKadosh Baruch Hu puts his dwelling, his Shekhinah, and the Egyptians forced us as slaves to use all of that creativity to serve them. That's a gigantic degradation. And that's the intellectual connection between the contexts that Toshis wants us to see. Okay. V'anitzak el Hashem Elokeinu Elokei Avoseinu v'shmer Hashem Yiskolenu v'yeres aniris l'chotzeinu. This is not brought with any supporting verses. But it says that Kodesh Baruch Hu heard our prayer, our cry, and he saw our deprivation and our efforts and the pressure that we were under. You didn't see it beforehand? You only saw it when we cried out? He was distracted with other matters? Right? So here is something which we have stressed many times. That we have no psychological description of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We're not getting a peek into his intellectual life or into his emotional life. Ain't davar kazeh. What it means is that he did things which are normally described by these words. And it means that now was a decision to do something about our suffering. Up until then, there wasn't any such decision. It was the prayer that triggered it. And the Gaon of Vilna says here something which is, I think, striking, surprising, and very basic, very, very indicative. You look in the book of Exodus and you see why HaKadosh Baruch Hu took us out of Egypt. There are two reasons given. One is that we are going to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu on the mountain where Moses was standing at the burning bush. We're going to receive the Torah. That means taking us out is an investment in our future. Also, it says, I made a promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I have a covenant with them. They're going to take you out. One thing it doesn't say is that these people are suffering. And it's not good they should be suffering. It's not right they should be suffering. I'm going to take them out and stop it and punish the Egyptians. It doesn't say that. In particular, for decades we suffered. It was a question of our suffering. We should have taken us out much earlier. But in order for the promise to the patriarchs to relate to the population in Egypt, they have to represent that promise. They have to represent that relationship. Because, as you know, 80% of the Jews in Egypt died and didn't make it out. Somehow the covenant didn't apply to them. And after the golden calf, God said to Moses, leave me alone. I'll wipe them all out and I'll make a covenant with you and your descendants. You'll make a new nation. What about the covenant? No, they're not relevant to the covenant. Oh, I'll keep it. Don't worry. I'll keep it. There'll be a Jewish people that I'll bring to the land of Israel, your descendants. And he said exactly the same thing after the crime of the spies. So when the verses say that God remembers the covenant with the patriarchs, that's not a magic wand that lets everybody in. You have to show yourself relevant to that covenant. So, here's what HaKadosh Baruch Hu did. He ramped up the servitude. He engineered that the Egyptians should ramp up the servitude and make it more and more bitter, so that they would cry out, so that they would pray to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so then they represent that connection with the patriarchs, and then the promise to the patriarchs can kick in and they can be saved. So, we look at suffering and we think, why does the HaKadosh Baruch Hu take away our suffering? Here, the suffering was the source of the Geula, the source of the redemption. Because without that, the promise to the patriarchs wouldn't have been relevant. Yeah.
But is there also an idea that the suffering is, that the teshuva is needed for the situation afterwards? Like, the Gehenna is needed to get to Gan Eden?
Let's see. The question is whether tshuva is needed for it to happen.
The suffering would be the teshuva. If there's no suffering, it would be completely impossible. It would go against the logic of the universe and how you have to.
Well, I think it's possible. Trying to think whether I know of any explicit source which says it. I think it's possible, but the gross point is that he'll take what you're saying and add it into his word. Right? It's not the tshuva itself. It's the fact that the tshuva means that they are representing what the avos stood for.
You just added to the word. It's not the ikar of the.
Right. It could be a separate, independent reason. That could be also. But he'll say he could recognize it and add it to his word. His word is, how are you going to take the verses that express Kodesh Baruch Hu's promise to the avos and use that as a reason for saving the Yidden? How can you use that promise? Harei Kodesh Baruch Hu isn't blindly bound by that promise. We see from the fact that twice the Kodesh Baruch Hu said to Moshe Rabbeinu, I'll kill them all out, so the promise wouldn't have saved them. The promise would not have saved them. The only person saved would have been Moshe Rabbeinu. And he would have started a new family and a new people. And the 80% died, the promise didn't save them. So what accounts for the fact that some get saved and some don't? The Gemara says, because the promise only saves those people who represent the promise, who are living the promise, not people who have turned their back on the promise. So if you say that they have to do tshuva means doing tshuva to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, etc., etc. So that's fine. But he'll use that as relating to the avos to therefore be connected to the promise. Not something as independent. It could be independent, it's just not his word. Yeah.
Is it necessarily conclusive that there has to be an einish for it to be teshuva?
No. It is not conclusive that they have to have owners to do tshuva. Indeed, the Baal Shem Tov said that there are two types of tshuvas. There's a tshuva on your averis, and there's tshuva on the mitzvahs that you didn't do as well as you could have and should have done them. And sometimes, he said, you'll have to do tshuva on your tshuva. Because if the tshuva is motivated by suffering, there's a strong selfish component. Suffering is painful, and I'd like to get out of the pain. What's causing the pain? That avera? Okay, I got the message. All right, I'll take care of it. Much better would have been for a person to have a general periodic review and say, wow, I did that mitzvah that way. No, I shouldn't have done it that way. I should have done a better job. The tshuva, so therefore, if the first tshuva is done because of suffering, later on he comes along and says, why did I wait to do the suffering to do tshuva? Why didn't I realize that my mitzvah was deficient, or that was an avera, that the avera was a deficiency? Let me just take a little instant here. And why didn't I realize on my own that the avera that I did was a deficiency, and correct it without having to have to do it? So certainly tshuva does not require suffering. It's better off the tshuva is done without suffering. It can happen. You see someone doing a mitzvah in an exquisite fashion, and you think, wow, I never thought of doing it like that. I saw someone asked for tzedakah, for charity, and the person said, come, let me help you. Do you need something to drink? Do you need something to eat? Do you want to sit down? Are you tired? Tell me, what are you asking for? What's your problem? I tell you that I'm davening for you. I hope that Kodesh Baruch Hu will help you with your problem. And here's the money you asked for, and thank you for the opportunity to do this mitzvah. I thought, wow, that's how you do tzedakah. That's how you give charity. I never dreamt of doing it that way. Then, if I'm a little kinder when I give charity, so, I realized that it could have been done in a better way, and I'm drawn up, not because of suffering, just because of a good example. That's a much better tshuva than someone who, starts losing money in the stock market. And, how come I'm losing all this money? And then he thinks, maybe it's because I'm not very nice about the way I give tzedakah, and improves the way he gives tzedakah. That's a second-rate tshuva, because it had to wait for punishments to wake him up.
So what we're saying that basically the way we had the onish and trying, that was the other tshuva. I mean, we could have been better. It's just that we've sunk to such a low level that was the only way to save it.
Well, the truth is, I'm not sure how much tshuva they did. I'm not sure how much tshuva they did. I remember tshuva being mentioned explicitly, number one. Number two, I think I mentioned to you, something my wife told me, which I hadn't sort of registered before, that the complaint of the angels, that they're of the Avodah Zarah, they're idol worshippers, was made 6 days after they left. After they brought the Korban Pesach and they did Bris Milah, when you think, they circumcised themselves and they brought the Paschal sacrifice, but no, the stamp of Avodah Zarah was still there. It had not been eradicated. It had not been taken care of. So I don't know how strong the tshuva was that they did for the things that they did in Egypt. But if it was the suffering that caused them to do the tshuva, the suffering, then that would have been a second-rate tshuva. Indeed, if there was a tshuva, it could be that the tshuva was inspired by the makos, by the plagues, not by the suffering. So, I don't know. I haven't seen sources on this. Yeah.
I don't want to get too on topic here, but if you could just quickly answer this question. You said that when it comes to teshuva, having consequences dealt on you, it's selfish to want to do teshuva. If you could have the wrong intentions, that you would just want the suffering to end. But with that understanding, I fail to see the reasoning then behind the punishment. Is the punishment needed to see your wrongdoings, and it seems it seems illogical when at the same time you're also trying to just get out of the punishment itself because it's difficult to be in it.
Okay, I wish I had a recording. I was recording what you said. I think you're asking a very good question, but you shifted your vocabulary at the end to be a little more cautious. Because you started off by saying, and you misquoted me, I didn't say it. You started off by saying, if you're doing tshuva only to avoid the suffering, only just to avoid the suffering, then it's totally egotistical. I did not say that. But that's what you said. And then at the end you said, if you're also doing it, also together with, so they're a little more cautious, a little more realistic, My mother wanted me to be a lawyer, and to a certain extent she got what she wanted. I paid very close attention to words, very close attention. Learned to do that, and I spent a lot of time working on getting just the right words. I said if it's partially to avoid the pain, and therefore it's partially egotistical, then it's less elevated than one which is the result of a positive motivation and not to avoid pain, because there's less of a personal element in it. But I didn't start with the idea that it's solely to avoid the pain.
Then what's the point of the pain?
The point of the pain is to make you re-examine your actions and notice what you've done wrong. In other words,
why would that make you notice what you're doing wrong instead of just seeing that it's something wrong? You know that you shouldn't have done this. Why do you need now consequences that don't necessarily reflect the...
Because, no, the other way around. Up until January 5th, 2015, I was doing fine. Then all of a sudden, I got a very painful condition. So something changed. Either something changed, or I've been ignoring something, and of course Baruch Hu is not tolerating it anymore. So it's not the things that I'm familiar with, or could be, but you examine your actions and see where you might be going wrong that you didn't take into account before. There's got to be a reason why it happened on January 5th, not January 4th. Right? So the natural thing is to say something I'm not taking care of that I wasn't aware of before. Okay, so that's that. Vanitzak El Hashem Elokeinu, Elokei Avoseinu. He called Asa. I got mixed up before. That's the verse from Deuteronomy. The whole verse. Now we're going through piece by piece, and we'll get attachments from Shemos. We called out to Hashem our God, the God of our fathers, as it says, Vayihi Bayamim Harabim Hahem Vayamas Mitzrayim. Was in those long many days that the king of Egypt died. The Jewish people groaned from their work. They cried out. And their cry rose up to HaKadosh Baruch Hu from their work. You have in the world today at least one regime which is a perfect exemplification of these words. The king died and they cried out, right? In North Korea, you're not allowed to cry at all. You're happy. This is the workers' paradise. Everything's wonderful here. You can only die when the dictator dies.
You have to cry.
And you have to cry. Right. That's right. Because that's a tragedy, right? So the Jewish people, the Medrash says, 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, the Medrash says they couldn't cry. You couldn't cry when Pharaoh was alive. That would be like criticizing the way he runs the country. But he died. So everybody was crying about the loss of Pharaoh. And the Jewish people were crying out of the terrible situation of their slavery, and their cry went up to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Vayishma Hashem es kolenu, Hashem heard our voice. Vayishma Elokim es na'akasam, vayizkor Elokim es briso, es Abraham, es Yitzchak, es Yaakov. So here it is again. Hashem heard our voice. He hears our voice all the time, and he heard the voice beforehand, and so on and so on. But now it means the time came to do something about it. It says, "Vayishma Elokim es na'akasam." Now that it came to time to do something about it is the continuation. And the Chod Baruch Hu remembered his covenant with Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And as we said when we learned Megillah Esther together, doesn't mean, oh gee, slipped my mind for a while. But now I'm back on track. We don't think of Hakadosh Baruch Hu that way. Lizkor means to decide to do something about a past fact. When it's describing Hakadosh Baruch Hu, it means to decide to do something about a past fact. And that sounds very artificial to you and very defensive, as if we don't want to admit that there are psychological descriptions of Hakadosh Baruch Hu. I will remind those who were here before, or teach those who weren't, that you have an explicit use of the word lizkor in Megillah Esther, the beginning of chapter 2, which has this meaning. Because in chapter 1, Achashverosh has his 6-month bash, and he demands that Vashti make an appearance, and she says no, and then he has to get his advisors together, decide what to do, and they put on a anti-feminist spin, and they get rid of her. And then chapter 2 begins, Vayizkor, Achashverosh has Vashti, Vayisasher Sosa, Nigzar Aleha, he remembered Vashti, and what she did, it was decreed against her. And surely we're not supposed to read it. He got so busy checking the books or buying new horses from Egypt that he lost track of Vashti. And then he goes, where is Vashti? She in Acapulco running up the credit card. Oh, I remember. I forgot about it. I remember we got rid of her. That's probably not the right shot. Of course he remembered what happened. But the time had not yet come to do something about it. Now the time came to get a new queen. So he then decides to confer with his aides, and they give him advice, and he sets up the process of getting a new queen. So when it says HaKadosh Baruch Hu remembers the covenant with the patriarchs, it doesn't mean in between he forgot, or that in between he could have forgotten. What it means is that now's the time to do something about it. And that goes together with what I said about the name of the Gemara. Since they cried out to him, That means they're identifying with him, identifying with their Jewish history. Now's the time to do it. Vayaras anyenu. Zuprishus derech eretz, separating from their wives. Here, the stress is on Hashem saw. There it means Hashem saw what other people didn't see. This is something that takes place in private. So observers aren't going to see this. And here you have the famous Gemara, which says that at a certain point the slavery became so difficult that the men said to their wives, we cannot take responsibility for bringing another generation into this terrible slavery. We're not going to father children. We're just not going to do it. And Medrash says that what the women used to do, by the way, the men and women were both enslaved. And after a hard day's work, both of them, the women would come out to the fields where their husbands were gasping for breath, and would bring with them 2 pots. 1 pot filled with just water, 1 pot filled with fish and water, and they would give the first pot to their husbands so they could wash themselves. And then they would make a little fire, and they would cook the fish out there in the fields. And then they would say to their husbands the most beautiful, puzzling words, am I not beautiful, more beautiful than you are? These were the copper mirrors that were made into the kior for washing. They would take the mirrors, sit next to the husbands, they'd take the mirrors so they could see, each could see both of their reflections, and they would say to their husbands, am I not more beautiful than you are? And with those words, influence the husbands to father the next generation. What interesting, puzzling words, poetical words. I'm more beautiful than you. One meaning it has is that you've given up hope. You've lost hope. You don't see a way forward. But we do. We women do. And we will take responsibility for it, and you can't deny us this. We'll take responsibility for it. And that's why Chazal say, B'schus noshim tzidkonios nig'alu avoseinu Mitzrayim. Because of the merit of the righteous women, our ancestors were redeemed from Egypt. And in one place, that statement of Chazal goes on, Losi Lovo will be the same thing. In the future, it'll be the schus of the women that will enable us to have that salvation from above. So this is a gigantic statement that the women kept that trust alive when the men had lost it. So this is what HaKadosh Baruch Hu saw. He saw that there was a separation. And by the way, this is epitomized by Moses. Amram and Yocheved, who are Moses' parents, had given birth to 2 children, to Miriam and Aaron. And then they too separated, and this is how it happened. Amram separated from Yocheved, and he was the leader of the generation, and word got around, and the other men followed his example. And Miriam said to her father, your decree is worse than that of Pharaoh. Pharaoh made the decree to drown the newborn male babies in the river. Your decree is that there won't be any more Jewish children. The Gemara cites 4 or 5 arguments she gave against her father, and he changed his mind, and he took Yocheved back with a big ceremony. It's a big public ceremony. They took her back, and that's when she became pregnant with Moshe Rabbeinu. Wow, it's right. And it's another thing. Here you see a woman, a young girl, arguing with her father, who's the Gottleib. He's the Chaim Kanievsky of that door. I mean, that brings him down, but I get an understanding of what. And he listens to her, and he admits that she's right and he's wrong. This is not the Judaism that you have, advertised in Reform Judaism and all the rest of it. They had no clue about these things. They think they were misogynists, the women are third-class citizens, or not citizens at all. They're only slaves, and so on and so on. Well, these are gigantic things. And it's recorded in our official literature, and everybody learns it. It's not something that's hidden or kept on the side or expurgated, so as to keep the male chauvinism and male dominance alive, and so on and so on. Okay, sorry. Don't get me started. The kind of stuff we have to live with, the kind of nonsense we have to live with. Yeah, Rahman is right. Okay, fine, next. Yes, Amalenu. Elo Abonim. Amal is a word for a certain type of effort. And it says, this refers to the children? No, to the sons. All the newborn males should be thrown into the river, and the newborn females should be kept alive. Now, I think the Gemara, the Megillah here, back on the boat, the Hagaddah here is making use of the semantics of the word Amal, and is brought out by a famous story about the Chafetz Chaim. When you finish a Masechta, there's a long recital about the general conditions of life and what learning is. And one of the things you say there is the difference between the Torah scholars and other Jews who are not Torah scholars. We work hard, we make a big effort, and others who have trades or businesses or production or whatever it is, work hard. We work hard and receive a reward. They work hard and they don't receive a reward. The Chafetz Chaim said, excuse me, they do support their families. I mean, they work hard and they get paid for it. So what does it mean that we work hard and get a reward, and they work hard and they don't get a reward? No, good try. Good try. No, he has something much deeper to say. To think about Talmud Torah. So let's imagine that you are a shoemaker. You see, those days you didn't have 600 boxes of shoes in a store and just hand them out. You made them. So somebody came in and you measured your foot, and 2 weeks later he came back and got shoes that were tailor-made to your size, the size of your foot. Okay, you come in, he measures you, come back in 2 weeks, says, here they are, and you put them on, and they don't fit. Well, if they don't fit, you don't pay him. You give him back the leather and say, thank you very much, but you don't pay him. He worked, and he didn't earn a reward. He didn't earn anything. Now, what's that comparable to? That's comparable to sitting in the Beis Medrash and breaking your head over a Tosfos, you and the Chavrusa, and studying and trying the Maharsha and the Maharshal and the Rashash and all the other commentaries. Nothing works. At the end of the 2 days or 3 days, you think, okay, I don't get it. I don't know what Tosfos wants. But for that, you get a reward. You didn't get it, and you get a reward, because your job is to make the effort. To occupy ourselves with divrei Torah. This is to understand, to analyze, to teach. I'm teaching something else, but the mitzvah is to be occupied with the divrei Torah. So that's what he means. When they're amelim and the project doesn't succeed, they don't get a schar. When we are amelim, project. So here, amel means now work which doesn't succeed in producing what it's supposed to produce. These are the children. When you go through pregnancy and birth, which is a lot of work, a lot of attention, it's a considerable danger, especially in ancient times. And then they come along, those Nazis, and throw your newborn child in the river, and you think, all that for nothing. All that for nothing. So that's what it says, Amalenu Elu Habani. Yeah.
Oh, you know the story when some tzaddikus or someone was telling us the other day that she came to this woman for a bracha, and she asked her, I was living as a Buddhist, this and that. And this woman told her, I was in the Holocaust. She's like, but Baruch Hashem, for me it wasn't as bad as you. Baruch Hashem, the Holocaust wasn't as bad as being so far away. So I was thinking of wow, it seems to be reminiscent of the fact that people are so close to Yiddishkeit, they're Jews, but they're so far away in this world, they don't even recognize it. And it's a crazy thing. And that's how they were in Egypt. I feel like they were close to a Kodesh Baruch Hu. He was there, but it was such a makom tuma, they couldn't, I don't know, for one purpose or another.
Okay, you're raising interesting points, and there's a lot there to be thought about and worked on. But I think what you heard came from a wonderful, wonderful book one of the most moving books in the last 30 years. It's called Holy Woman by Sarah Rigler, who lives in the Old City, and she spent 14 years in an ashram before she came to Yiddishkeit. It's one of my wife's best friends. I would strongly recommend reading it. I read it once, and I haven't gotten up the courage to read it again because I cried through it. It's just so awesome. And that she's the one who said it. This holy woman, this Rebbitzin, she said it. Holocaust wasn't so bad. She saw her 2 parents shot to death. She said, they died al Kiddush Hashem. That's the highest madrega that you can aspire to. I should be upset that they died al Kiddush Hashem, that they had such a successful Jewish life. You read that and you think, what? That's how she looked at things. And there's more and more in that book. It's an amazing book. It's a really, really amazing book. I would strongly recommend it. Okay. V'es lachatzenu. Lachatz means pressure. And zu atchak. Dochak also means pressure. It means putting something into a tight space. So, since the verse used the same word lachatz that's in our verse, when it says zu atchak, it's shall I say, it's another word to express what lachatz is. But it means it was tough. They were under pressure. They were short of sleep and short of strength. And they got beaten. Vayotzienu Hashem Mitzrayim v'ad chazaka v'zor natuya v'or osas mofti. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu took us out from Egypt. Now we got 5 different elements here, with a strong hand, an outstretched arm, great, awesome events. Osos are miracles, but an os is usually like a symbol of something else. They communicate an idea. And mofsi means spectacular breaches of nature. And I'll make a philosophical remark before we go through the psukim. A strong hand. God is credited with strength on a number of occasions. Yad Chazaka is one. He's called Gibor also, which Gibor usually refers to some kind of power. What is strength? What is power? Strength and power are the ability to overcome resistance, to make something do something where there's a counteractive force, whether it's gravity or whether it's friction or magnetism, or there's something in opposition that has to be overcome. Now, if you're going to call God strong, you have to ask yourself, what kind of resistance is relevant that you say, listen, God's going to attempt X, but you have to realize X is really tough. X has, it's a hard thing. There's resistance there. So, but don't worry. God's strong enough to overcome the resistance. What is it, moving a galaxy? I mean, that's a joke. He's creating it. It seems to me there couldn't possibly be any force against God in this world that God wouldn't be able to overcome. So what is meant by saying that he has strength? And one right answer is that we're talking here about an internal conflict. We're talking about one of God's midos versus another one of God's midos. He's conflicted within himself, so to speak. That's resistance. Because one midah, for example, wants to provide good to someone, something good, pleasant, happy. And the other midah, which is the midah sadin, says, look at the tragedy, look at the crime that he committed. He doesn't deserve it. So the two divine midas are in conflict with one another. That's opposition. That's resistance. Now what you're saying is that this midah is strong enough to overcome the other midah and issue the outcome. The struggle is, and then you have to ask yourself in the context, which midas are you talking about? That's the only pshat in strength for HaKadosh Baruch Hu that I can understand. Because the only kind of opposition that makes any sense whatsoever. And we do have on record that the Midas Hadin, the attribute of strict justice, opposed the Exodus. I mentioned it to you earlier today and other occasions. Halal over the Avodah halal over the Avodah Zarah. The Midas Hadin complains to Kodesh Baruch Hu, here you are with this conflict between the Jews and the Egyptians, and you're favoring the Jews and you're punishing the Egyptians. Why? Why are you doing that? The Jews also worshipped idols, or worship idols in Egypt before, after. So why are you doing that? So here, God's kindness, if it's loving kindness, that's the right midah. Might not be, might be kesser. Okay, forget I said that. That's doing it. But whatever midah it is, the midah has to overcome the midah of strict justice. And strict justice is a divine midah. So that's part of what's going on here when it talks about strength. Okay. Yeah.
Is it not the fact that it's that you have to usually when you attribute, you have to attribute human qualities to God, and it always has to be the greater than, like the better opposite.
Yes, I think that's right. But
what's better than strong? Just limitless?
No, it's not. It's not a question of better or worse, but it's a question of it's having application, which is really praiseworthy. See, I'm not getting a good example comes to mind, but let's take something which is too mild. Somebody says, one of the greatnesses of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is that he knows 20th century German history very well. What? 20th century. Better than any historian. No, see? No. Because one knows everything. Everything, capital E, capital V, capital E, everything, right? So saying that he knows German history, like, okay, it's not that certainly it's better to know German history than not to know German history, that's true, but it's too little to be. So it's not a question of specific. German history of 20th century is very specific. That's very specific.
No, the more specific, the worse it is.
Well, maybe, but it's not specificity that's an issue now. As being the best is very specific, but it's very good. It's not the fact that it's specific. It's that what it says about him is something which should be unnecessary to say. Should be taken for granted and unnecessary to say. Strong, as I said, the word strength means the ability to overcome resistance. The attitude we ought to have is resistance against God? There's no such thing. There's no such thing. Doesn't start. He doesn't have strength to overcome it. There's nothing to overcome. That's why saying strength would be too small to be worthwhile saying. Sure, being strong is better than being weak, but it's so little of a thing vis-a-vis God. It's very funny to say it, unless there's some resistance, which is significant.
Maybe it has an implication of like strength. It has an implication that he's overcoming some resistance. If you say he has 20th century Germany, that means he doesn't know 19th century. Or he's expert in only 20th century.
Yeah, but the question is, what kind of resistance is relevant vis-a-vis God? Right? Well, it's taking an Olympic runner and saying he can beat everybody who's under age 5. It's true, he can. And that's better than not beating them all. But he's an Olympic runner. You're like, why'd you bring up people age 5?